27 country gets to draw up its trade policy from scratch. After 2020, the United Kingdom was no longer bound by a common EU position on trade and tax. We were free for the first time to do our own trade deals. And of course, the pandemic hit a year later, a month later, so things got rather deferred, but still we are in that moment where we're able fundamentally to rethink a trade policy that was dictated by a collective European interest, which understandably was continental rather than global or maritime in its conception. But I think it's also worth saying that India has been in a benign moment of transition from a free market perspective. Those of you from India may not notice this because we're all, it's human nature to take for granted the things that are happening around you. So let me say it from the outside. There has been the most extraordinary opening up over this century of the Indian economy, which was for a long time unusual in the extent to which it was closed. And this goes right back to the circumstances of independence. Think of the Indian flag, think of the blue wheel in the middle, right? What the actual immediate derivation of that symbol was. If you look at a Congress Party flag, it was a hand loom. It was the kind of hand loom that Gandhi used to carry around. Right? And after independence, it was turned from a chakra into a chakra. It became a more inclusive symbol. But because of the moral stature of Gandhi, for a long time after independence, people stuck to the idea that independence meant self-sufficiency, meant producing things wherever possible yourself. And it took a while for the penny to drop that actually self-sufficiency not only makes you poorer, but actually makes you less secure. That if you really want security, food or steel or whatever other commodity, the best way to secure it is to source from as wide a diversity of suppliers as possible, so that you are not subject to a local shock or disruption which might as easily happen on your own territory as anywhere else. We seem to have moved away globally from that truth, and it's worth reminding ourselves of all the talk we now have of reshoring and friendshoring, all the rest of it. The extension of supply lines, the extension of comparative advantage and commerce has been the single biggest driver of prosperity. I think the UK and India have a really unique opportunity. Two economies of this size having a proper open free trade agreement based on mutual recognition of professional qualifications as well as free trade in goods and services would be a huge antidote to the protectionist tendencies that we see in the world around us. And I can't think of any other country. India, as I say, is since the 90s, has been open. It's been doing trade deals with surrounding countries, often with quite small economies, with Mauritius and so on. Right? It has one fairly impressive trade deal with Japan. But this could be the big one. And if not the UK, there are 1.5 million Brits of Indian origin. We share a language, we share a legal system. If there's a dispute between two parties, it will be arbitrated in ways that both understand and are familiar with. India is already a huge investor here, because investment, unlike trade, is not controlled by the EU. India owns, as you all know, all the great brand names here. I do some work for a company called JCB, which makes figures. Now, if you grow up in this country, JCB, if you're a little boy anyway, is pretty much the first company name you learn, right? It's almost synonymous with our national interest. And yet, when I go to India, I'm always surprised by how many people, educated, clever, well-traveled people, are rather astonished to learn that JCB is not in fact an Indian company. Or, even if they kind of know on one level that it's not an Indian company, technically, they tend to think of it, rather than the way they think of cricket, as an essentially Indian institution that may happen to have been technically headquartered somewhere else, but is fundamentally an Indian success story, and they're right. They're right. That company made a huge bet. My boss, Lord Bamford, made a rather counter-cyclical bet in the early 70s that India was going to be where the growth was, and he has never looked back. And that's been hugely to the benefit of both countries. Now, what can we do still ongoing. Change of government here has not technically led to any dropping of the agenda. Although I fear that the foot may have eased off the accelerator a little bit because the current government is more focused on deals with the EU. But it's not an either-or situation. India is blessed with an extremely dedicated, brilliant, and devoted High Commissioner here who is continuing to push for a comprehensive and ambitious deal. And we shouldn't lose sight of the prize. This is not just about tariffs. I mean, that's the easy stuff, and we could agree that very simply. By the way, going back to the Chaka and Gandhi, Gandhi would be astonished to learn, scared as he was of Lancashire cotton being imported into India, that it's now the other way around. That the tariffs are now here. 9.6% tariff on men's shirts, among other things. Right? That's the easy stuff. Getting rid of the textile tariffs, the whiskey tariffs the other way around. But I think we could be much more ambitious. We should, for example, be looking to make it easier for business people to travel. It's extraordinary that the argument over Tier 4 visas is always seen as an immigration rather than as a commercial issue. We want to make it easy for, and this applies in both directions, we want to make it easier for people to travel for commercial purposes. We want both countries to adopt global standards on food safety, on SPS. The UK is illegally sticking to a number of EU standards which are unscientific and which hamper imports from India. That's something that would be in the interest of both countries. But I think the biggest gains are in services. If the extraordinary growth rates of India are going to be maintained, we need to make it easier for people to access the best and cheapest legal services, financial services, banking services, education services. And that will mean changes in changes in the rules that currently require British companies to have local parties or to establish themselves separately as India. That, I think, is of potentially great benefit, although I don't, for a moment, want to downplay how difficult it is. There is no group in the world, in any country, more able and protectionist than lawyers. They are brilliant at exempting themselves with all sorts of clever arguments from any kind of liberalisation. But still, we should aim high and do what we can. We're running very late, so I don't want to delay things. I'm going to keep this short. And in fact, I hope you'll excuse me. I have to be in Parliament, so I hope you'll excuse me if I leave at the originally scheduled time, because I'm in a debate this afternoon. But I just want to finish by saying this. At the end of the last session, somebody asked a question about the unpredictability of the new US president. And he is certainly unpredictable, except in one field. The one thing in which he has been completely consistent is in wanting tariffs and protection. And I'm afraid that he is swimming with the current globally. After the end of the Second World War, we had 6-7 decades of gradual global trade liberalisation, and it coincided with an unprecedented rise in living standards. If I think of the changes just in my lifetime, I was born in 1971. In 1971, a stationary vehicle emitted more pollution than a vehicle today moving at full speed. In 1971, it took the average British worker 2 months to be able to afford a TV set. Now it's 3 days. In 1971, fewer than half of girls got anything beyond primary education. Now outside Afghanistan, it's effectively 100%. There have been incredible rises in living standards, extraordinary alleviation of poverty, not least on the subcontinent, because of this global opening, because we stopped trying to make everything ourselves and accepted the opportunities that would come from better and cheaper imports. I think that if we see the current move reinforced back towards self-sufficiency, back towards national trade barriers, then we risk undoing the extraordinary force of free trade as a global instrument of poverty alleviation, of conflict resolution, and of social justice. And so here is one thing we can do. A tie-up between the depending on how you measure it, the fifth and sixth or sixth and seventh or fifth and seventh biggest economies on the planet. That would be based on removing barriers, moving the rocks so that the grass can grow, unleashing enterprise and giving consumers the best possible deal. If you don't advocate for this, who else is going to? I mean, great, I love all the ESG stuff, you know, if that makes you happy, great, but this really matters and is critical to our businesses and therefore, by extension, to everyone else, to every consumer, to every sailor, to everyone who benefits from a rise in living standards. That's where we need to get your voices. That's the battle we need to win. If we don't, if this free trade moment of the late 20th century turns into something